You're rolling.
Okay, well, welcome. Thank you guys for coming in. This is our endorsement interview for Measure 26243. And can I have just one of you talk for 3 or 4 minutes about what this measure would do and why it's important?
Oh, that's me?
Well, so Colin and I are public employees, so we're
But yeah, please
sure
identify
facts.
yourself.
So
if you-
Oh, yeah, that first,
Jim
yeah.
Daw with the Drainage District or Flood Safety Agency, depending on which day. And again, I'm on paid leave just in case, because I take the elections law seriously, but I am a public
Sure.
employee, so I'm going
Got
to
it.
talk
Okay.
about the facts.
Okay, Jake?
I'm Jake Wegler. I'm with Praxis, consulting firm in town, and we're doing the Yes for Flood Safety campaign.
Okay.
And I'm Colin Rowan with the Flood Safety District.
Got it.
And he has a lot more history than I do, so he actually knows things.
Got it. Okay. All right, Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll start very simply and then we can dive into all the details. Essentially, there's a system of flood control infrastructure that's along the Columbia River. So if you think about it, it kind of starts near where the Expo Center is and then goes all the way out to Troutdale. So that's the Columbia River floodplain. That was initially built in the 20s and the 30s, primarily to reclaim that land for agriculture. Obviously, it's used for a lot of different things now. But a lot of the infrastructure hasn't been kept up to date. And the most horrible example, of course, is the Vanport flood, where something that was a railroad embankment that was being used as a levee, we learned that that doesn't work to act as a levee, and of course everyone knows what happened there. But to flash forward, to where we are today, so there are 4 special districts that operate to manage that flood control system. They're very small, they have very modest revenue structures, and so after Hurricane Katrina occurred, the federal government, FEMA, and Army Corps looked at how they were certifying levees around the country and said, yeah, clearly, we thought these levees were certified, the hurricane happened, tons of people died, we need to reevaluate that. And so once they completed that process and came back and said, this is what you need to do to maintain certification of your levees, it was clear that those 4 districts did not have the capacity to do that. They didn't have the ability to bond or do other kind of capital generation to do the necessary upgrades to maintain federal accreditation. And so that has led to a long process that these 2 can tell you a lot more about, a decade of public process that is culminating where we are today, which is to create a new special district that was actually created by the legislature in 2019 to encompass all 4 of those districts as well as the rest of Multnomah County within the urban growth boundary, and then to bond to do the capital construction work that needs to be done to maintain accreditation and a number of other benefits for the community as well. And so that's the very simple overview, but I'm happy to dive into all of it.
So this measure would create the district?
No, the district was created in 2019 by the Oregon legislature.
This measure
would pass a bond to pay for those improvements.
And 150 million?
The bond is for 150 million. There's 100 million in federal matching funds that will be secured once we secure our skin in the game, as well as a request that'll be in front of the legislature in 2025 for an additional 50 million in state funding. So about 300 million in capital construction. The bond pays for half of it.
Explain why the county just doesn't go out and sell the bonds, why you have to create a special district. What's the reasoning behind that?
I will turn this over to them
I can
because this
dive
is
in.
before
So
my time.
when the community learned that the system was out of compliance with federal regulations, they went to Oregon Solutions, convened a stakeholder table that had over 24 governments, associations, businesses, enviros, and they talked about the best way to solve this problem. They looked at the county doing it, they looked at Metro doing it, the port doing it, City of Portland doing it, and the agreement among the parties at the time was to go to the legislature to create a special district to take over the existing 4 districts' work and to issue the bonds. The county was focused on human services. City of Portland wasn't trusted by East County. The port wasn't trusted by anyone. Metro was in the throes of the arts funding and houseless services funding and didn't want to take on additional stuff.
Okay, so pardon my ignorance. So by creating a district, what does that mean in terms of infrastructure? I don't mean the levies. I mean, is we creating a separate government body?
We have 4 governments now running the system. We're going to replace those 4 with 1.
Right. So talk to me about the people involved in those 4 districts as opposed to 1, the size of that.
Yeah, after 1996, the 4 districts consolidated their staffing through intergovernmental agreements. So I'm the director of all 4 of the legacy districts plus the new one.
Okay.
And so the same staff will carry over.
So tell us about the size of your operation.
We have about 40 people currently currently with a couple of
And
vacancies.
what's your budget?
Our budget in the current fiscal year, including grants and capital, is about $19 million, and our proposed budget for year one of the new district is 16.7 with some additional grants and capital.
And that money comes from the county general fund or from,
Good question. It comes today, the legacy districts levy a property assessment on private property and public property that's on the managed floodplain. The new district will continue assessments on the managed floodplain and will also institute a new intergovernmental flood safety benefit fee on the rest of the district, the entire district. The new district is all of Multnomah County inside the urban growth boundary. That fee is allocated to the cities and the county based on population within the district.
so the fee appears on the property taxes of businesses and residences who are in the floodplain?
That's the property assessment, and then the fee will be charged to the cities
Okay.
within the district, and the cities will determine if and how to
And
collect
then
that.
tell me what your staff of 40 does. What's their skill set? What do they do?
Good questions. Well, we keep the levees in good shape and we mow them every year. And then we also have 16 pump stations. One thing people often don't think about is when you build a wall along the river to keep it from coming in, the water that used to flow out can't get out. So all the rain that falls, all the water that comes down the ridge, all the water that comes up from the ground has to be moved over the tops of the levees.
So again, these 40 employees, they're largely blue collar workers doing stuff like levee
We're about-
repair and mowing lawns?
Yeah, there's
I'm just trying to sort through.
Yeah, the majority of our staff is out in operation, so they're fixing the pumps and they're keeping those channels and culverts clear and raking the trash grates in front of the intakes of the pumps, inspecting the levees, mowing the levees, moving campers off the levees, all those kinds of things. The rest of the
And-
staff is finance, HR, people like me.
And
planners.
They're technically county employees?
No, we're our own agency.
As
through-
of 19.
No,
as of-
the legacy districts were formed in 1917.
And they were their own agency?
They're their own agency. So we're like the Soil and Water Conservation District, a water district,
School districts.
to Alton Valley Parks and Rec.
Yeah,
Metro is
district.
a special district, yeah.
PERS employees?
PERS employees.
So if this measure passes, what would be, remind me what the legislative ask would be?
50 million.
50 million, okay, and you would ask for that in when?
We're hoping to generate that revenue from the state over the next 5 biennia.
Okay, and what sort of guarantees or safeguards do we have around that funding? Is there any guarantee we're
No
gonna get that
guarantees.
funding?
No, no guarantees.
And
We
what
have-
happens if we don't
Legislative
get
action is
that?
required. We would seek alternative funding sources, or we would have to scale back projects. One of
Okay,
those two.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. And then what about the federal matching funds? Are those guaranteed, or is that another, we might get this, we might not get this?
Great question. They're authorized. So in Congress, there's 2 steps to getting funding. You have to be authorized. And so we're authorized for the full 100 million through what's called the Water Resources Development Act. And then appropriations are annual. We've been in the president's budget and won appropriations over the last 3 years, and we're in the president's proposed budget.
So
But
that,
again, being annual.
yeah, so that funding that's secured? Or is there a way that can fall through somehow?
It could fall through, but
Okay.
there's a 2-phase process, well, 3-phase. There's an investigation phase that we've completed and we identified all the work that's required. Then we got authorization to do the design of those projects. We're in year 2.5 of design, and then once design is done, you get a construction authorization, and typically you roll through the rest of the funding needs. WARDA is one of the few bipartisan realms in Congress that still remains.
So you
once
think
those-
it's a high likelihood that?
Very high likelihood. yes.
Okay. So what happens if we pass this measure, we go out and bond for 150 million, and for some reason we don't get the money from the legislature, and we also don't get the money from the feds? Is this project stalled indefinitely until we can?
We would
secure
still use the
funding?
150 million to advance the critical projects that we need to
Okay.
do, and then we would continue to seek additional funds through other sources, both through Congress and potentially through the state.
And how far
we could do
would
some
that-
private financing as well.
How far would that 150 million go?
Colin, I don't know how to define that for sure, but
Yeah.
it's about a $300 million total program. So
Right, and we'd be able to, so the very minimum is that we have to recertify the levees. Levy certification is needed to maintain FEMA accreditation. It's really important, it's for the National Flood Insurance Program. And so because our levees are accredited, it means that FEMA doesn't come in and remap it and basically map that whole area as a special flood hazard area. If that happens, it would mean that there's Planning Rule 7 gets triggered at the state level, they would have to go in, cities would have to change their zoning, people that have federally backed mortgages might lose their notes. So there's just this whole bad series of things going. At a minimum, for about $50 million, we would be able to recertify the levees, but we really need, it wouldn't bring us up to federal standards. We'd still need to pursue additional funding.
And everyone in that flood zone, if you guys lost accreditation, would have to pay for their own flood insurance? And how expensive is that? Can you give us any sense of what that would be annually for, a homeowner versus?
We've seen estimates that it's up to 10 times as much.
What's
As-
wrong with people paying their own flood insurance?
Well, right now, when the levy is certified, you have access to the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a federally subsidized program. So
Right.
it's a much more advantageous option.
Right.
Whereas if you have to go out and buy in the private market, it's a
The
much
irony,
higher
of course,
cost.
is that the congressman in that area, Earl Blumenauer, no one has been more outspoken about the absurdity of flood insurance and subsidizing people living in floodplains. No one in America has been.
Well, and I think that, and I was
this
like, note, he did submit a voter pamphlet saying in support and has been a strong advocate of this. And I think, there is a fork in the road for us right now about the existing infrastructure and maintaining it and maintaining that certification. I think there's a very compelling case for that. I think you could step back and have a larger conversation about what does development look like in a floodplain? If we were starting at scratch, what does that look like? But clearly we're not there, right? Like the airport's there,
Yeah.
all 3 interstates are there. There's an enormous hub for economic activity. You think about all those warehouses that are near to the airport.
What
About
kinda-
50% of the supply chain for the state or for the region is actually based there because that's where tons of goods and materials get brought in.
So what are the
Heavy
big
industrial, et
businesses
cetera.
in the floodplain zone?
Well, so let's start, you think about Troutdale out east, you have the FedEx and the Amazon fulfillment centers right there. And then as you move west, you think about
You have Heister
industrial-
making a lot of.
Who?
Heister making
Heister,
manufacturing
yeah,
the
equipment.
Boeing manufacturing plants there, the airport. Several unions have the building trades unions have their training facilities there.
Didn't
goes on.
Prologis just open a bunch of warehouses there, like right where Portland Meadows used to be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Prologis
have
has a
these
presence too.
businesses, what's been their involvement? I mean, it seems like if this is that concerning, they're bajillion-dollar companies, couldn't they pitch in some funding?
They are very supportive, and they of course will continue to pay as properties within the zone.
But they're not paying anything additional to support this project?
Like putting in money on their own as a private entity?
Yes.
No.
So this is being brought about because the feds changed the certification levels. They basically said levees need to be safer.
After Katrina.
Right.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
give us an example of a levee that now exists that is no longer considered safe in this district, and what do you do to bring it up to code, if that's what you will? What's involved?
Okay, thanks. Let's talk about the biggest one. There's a railroad berm on the western edge of our district that's by the Heron Lakes Golf Course.
Uh-huh.
That is an old railroad berm that has served as a levee. The railroad won't give us any permission to go look at it. It's the site of the major failure in the 1948 flood that wiped out Van Port.
It is basically a dirt berm?
It's a dirt berm on top of an old, I think it's treated lumber.
Yes.
Yeah, trestles. So they poured dirt on it. The Corps has come in a couple of times to finance repairs there, but we're going to build a whole new levee inside of that meets modern standards. So.
What material? I'm just wondering, what material do you use these days?
I'm not a geotech, so we could get that, but it's going to be a combination of riprap at the bottom, so big boulders and gravel and sand as you get closer to the top. We're actually working with the Corps and the Port of Portland to use dredge spoils that are located at West Hayden Island, so it's cheaper to move them for
The Corps, can you-
construction. Oh, Corps of Engineers.
Okay.
So
Apologies.
who will be responsible for actually overseeing the work of rebuilding the levees? Is it you and your district?
There is a suite of projects that will be managed by the Army Corps, and then the rest of the construction will be managed by the district. And we'll be working with the Corps in partnerships. We're called the local sponsor of the Corps program.
So will you be awarding bids for contracts for repair work? or
We will,
this-
and the Corps will.
Okay, so this isn't going to be done by your staff, and it's not going to be done by the Corps of Engineer. We're going to have outside contractors do the levee work? That's a question.
I think,
Most of the
yeah, most of
construction
it will
work.
be. Yeah, some of our staff will do some of the construction work on some of the aspects.
And are there
of it.
firms in the Portland area that's, in the way that Rydell used to be the firm to go to when you want to dredge the river? Are there firms that specialize in levee construction?
There are some, they're usually geotech and engineering firms, but there's a variety of them. We have a range of existing contracts that we use with Cornforth Consulting, with Wolfwater Resources. Who else do we? Parametrics is another one that we rely on.
So my last question, this is going on all over the country, right? Because the feds changed their rules,
Yeah.
and I assume we're not the only district that is out of compliance. What are other areas of the country doing to address this? Are they creating special districts? Do they do it within existing bodies of government? I'm just wondering if you've looked at best practices.
Yeah, so I have the good fortune of being on the board of directors of the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management.
But you guys have wild
Yeah,
parties.
yeah. We do want to have an acronym reduction committee, but we just haven't had time to do that. And so, yeah, there are a lot of different approaches. Most areas don't have property tax limitations the way Oregon does.
Right.
So the districts are typically either creatures of a county, and so they rely on county funding. There are also a lot of other districts who are seeking federal support and state support. We were one of only 6 projects to get authorized nationally in the last round of WRDA, so it's very competitive for the federal funding. But yeah, everybody's struggling to figure out the best ways to raise local revenue, to provide either local match or make these kinds of improvements.
Has Governor Kotek said whether she will advocate for legislative funding? Like, has she given you guys a promise of whether or
I
not?
think we sent to you a letter that she sent to us saying she's supportive of the project, and we've been working closely with Business Oregon, who's helping us strategize the best approach to the legislature in the next
I
session.
understand she's in support of it, but there does seem to be this question of, well, we also need these legislative funds. Has she said whether she's going to be active in advocating for it rather than just
I've
being
not
a
spoken to
passive?
her directly. Her staff has been very
Okay.
proactive and helpful, and we've already received over $10 million in state funding through the Levy Grant Fund and the Levy Loan Fund. So the state's been a good partner to date, and back when you were covering this earlier, Business Oregon, after our first call, got on the phone and has been very proactive and helpful. So we're confident, but Governor's got a broad portfolio and has, again, expressed support, but I would ask you to talk to the Governor's office about their
How's this going to show up
actions.
on my bill? Like, is it a proper?
Oh, sorry, this happens in the morgue.
You didn't pay your bill.
Conversation.
Oh, that's where the
You
line.
guys, no, just kidding.
And my property tax bill is going to be a new line.
Yeah, if you're a property owner,
Yeah.
you would see the bond costs reflected on your bill, just like other GO bonds.
And what is is there an average that you predict?
The estimate, worst case, is 11 cents per thousand. That would be
Property
if,
value?
yeah, if the district issued all the debt at once and paid it off over 20 years, which is not the strategy.
11 cents per thousand, and that's
Of assessed
that's for
value.
everybody in. You
In the
said
district.
The district is Multnomah.
Multnomah
Multnomah
County
County,
within the UGB.
inside the UGB.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's an extension because now it's
Just the managed floodplain.
and the floodplain goes how far up the ridge?
I think Columbia Boulevard.
Yeah.
So
it's much bigger.
are the property owners in the floodplain district right now, are they going to see an increase, or are they?
The proposed budget that our board is considering contemplates a 10% overall increase in the amount of revenue the district will receive from assessments. How that 10% increase in revenue from assessments on the floodplain impacts individual property owners is complicated because assessed values changed. the way
Is it
we-
generally going to be an increase
It
though?
will generally be an increase, but there are
Okay.
some who go up, some who go down. So some of the factors are property assessments, compression, and then the third is we use an allocation methodology for our costs. So there's flood protection costs. So when we're working on levees a lot, people who benefit directly from the levees pay more. We also have stormwater peak and stormwater average and unallocable costs. So depending on the work we're doing in any given fiscal year, the price to a homeowner may change.
So
or property
maybe
may
this is
change.
a dumb question, but like it just, it kind of blows my mind that you guys have FedEx and Amazon and Prologis. I mean, these just bajillion-dollar companies, and they won't cough up more than what they.
Well, they're paying huge amounts in assessments currently, and they'll pay for the bond, and they'll pay for the
Sure,
increased
but we've
assessments.
got this 3-year supposed tax moratorium going on. Taxpayers are really sick of paying taxes. Was it like out of the question for you guys to go to Amazon or FedEx and be like, hey, could you each chip in 10 million? I mean, was that even part of the question, or was that like, we know this isn't going to happen, that's not even worth a question?
And it didn't come up in all of the governance discussions to go seek contributions from private companies. We went through the legislative process and the Oregon Solutions process and came up with this approach of using assessments on the floodplain and
Okay.
property tax-based general obligation bonds.
Are there
Who's opposed to this measure?
I'm not aware of any active
Any,
opposition.
like
but
anyone?
Again, I'm
no
not,
legislators or?
No, I think we've done a really good job engaging with different stakeholders and finding a way to get to yes.
So there's
Are there-
no campaign that you're aware of?
There's no opposition statements.
Okay.
Even some of the stakeholders who are more skeptical, I think, have recognized that this is a needed step.
And how much have you guys raised?
On the campaign side, $12,000 maybe.
And who's the biggest contributor so far?
We have received support largely from the public utilities, the IOUs, I should say.
Are there any levees or flood protection in the county that your district is not responsible for because it's on federal land or state land? I'm just wondering if there's any other.
Columbia River and Columbia Slough.
That's it?
Yeah, that's it. So we won't be handling Willamette River, Johnson Creek, local stormwater flooding. That's the cities.
And of course, there's Willamette, but that's a whole other conversation.
So I know this, but it'd be helpful probably for our viewers. Can you guys talk about the kind of now or never part of this? Like, why is it important that we do this? Like, we have to get it passed on this ballot or what?
I'll start with the obvious thing, which is a flood is bad. That's maybe not the most time-sensitive thing, but I think it was interesting to see there's a 2021 Army Corps engineer study that compared kind of risk of levee failure versus the big one, earthquake, and actually found we have a higher annual risk of a levee failure right now than we do of having the big one occur.
Terrific.
Which is crazy because, yeah, we hear all about the earthquake, we never hear about floods. And a flood would have a pretty dramatic impact. There's a Dugami study from 2018 at the state showing you'd have about $7 billion in cleanup if you had, a once every 100 or 500 year flood. And so there'd be massive cleanup costs. It would lead to a lot of business closures in the floodplain because of the delay in kind of getting back up. There's also all this toxic pollution that gets spread, surface pollution gets spread around during a flood, so it'd have a huge environmental impact. Plus the disruption to the regional economy, whether it's the transportation infrastructure, I mentioned all 3 interstates go through there, the airport, other things, as well as it's a major hub for industrial activity. And there's a lot of low-income communities. You think about North and Northeast Portland out there, those are neighborhoods that cannot absorb easily the cost of trying to recover from a flood. So that's kind of the existential threat, but there are a couple of specific reasons independent of a flood to do this now. One, as Colin alluded to, is the loss of accreditation, which has a couple of implications. One is that loss of the National Flood Insurance Program, so every property owner will immediately have to pay significantly more.
And sorry, real
yeah.
quick, when would we lose accreditation? Like, is there a date when we would lose
It's
that if we
the
don't pass
Army
this?
Corps stops to see good faith efforts to move towards.
Okay, so if
getting
you guys didn't
licensing
pass
compliance.
this,
Yeah,
they
this
would
be a big
have good
signal.
reason to
Yeah.
say we don't see a good faith effort.
And there's a
this
precedent for this. So Milton Freewater has its own flood control infrastructure along the Columbia up the river. In 2008, they failed to pass a bond, and the district board actually chose to dissolve themselves. They were so frustrated with the community, and so at that point, the Army Corps decertified their levee system. They had to rezone all of Milton Freewater, and it basically cratered economic development for 3 years. They had a major employer that was going to locate that said, under the development restrictions now, we're not interested. They had a federal grant to do, or a community block grant to do a child care facility. That got pulled because you can't put federal funds into a high-risk flood control floodplain. There was no building permits pulled during that 3 years. The city manager will talk about basically until they got their stuff together, passed a bond, and got back towards certification. It really cratered the entire.
So
local
if
economy.
this measure fails, you think it's more likely than not that the Army Corps of Engineers will say there's a lack of good faith effort?
Once they see that we're not on a path to get to yes, it opens up that conversation. I can't say
Okay.
definitely like the next day they call and say sorry, and Joe's on the phone and says sorry, it's canceled. But that is, and as we've talked about, there's 10 years in process that have gotten us to this point. So it showed a lot of steps to get to this point. So it's a real risk. And then separate from the flood insurance program, the other risk, of course, is the development restrictions. Once that rezoning occurs, all new construction that would occur in the floodplain has to have major mitigation efforts, which could be like you have to build the ground floor of your building 10 feet off the ground to anticipate a flood, which dramatically increased development costs.
Like the Florida Keys.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you think about other areas where they can't control for floods, you just have to build around it. And so there's that, there's the loss of federal funds. It's a whole variety of SBA and other types of loans you lose access to if you're operating in that floodplain, as well as some other types of development restrictions. Anytime you try and make upgrades or pull a permit to do change to the building, you say, okay, well now you have to bring it into compliance with all these new zoning rules. So quite aside from the flood, once we lose that accreditation, there's some real risks, as well as losing the $100 million. You know, as they've said, you know, the president has been great in putting this in his budget and having it be authorized. We need to actually get it appropriated and passed, and we do have a election coming up in November, and we'd like to think that regardless of who's sitting in the White House, we'll get it in the budget, but it's not a guarantee. And so there's some definite advantages to doing it now.
And polling shows that what, just really quickly?
We showed 60 to 65% support based on how you asked the question when we polled.
And that's pretty good.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. No, as a consultant, that's where I'm like, okay, let's go.
Yeah. Okay.
Is Clatskanie out of compliance? Are they not accredited anymore? Do you know?
I don't.
I can talk. Well, so there's
Just
a number of levee systems along the Columbia River, but we're the only ones that is in an urban environment.
Okay.
So there's a lot of agricultural ones, even in Scappoose, Sauvie Island, Clatskanie, but they have a different standard
Okay.
than
Lower?
the urban levee system. Yes,
Got it.
lower. The risk is just so much lower.
Yep.
I'm thinking of 60,000 employees behind levees and 8,000 residents versus agricultural land that
Yeah.
can be
So
sort
a
of
giant airport.
rehabilitated quickly. Yeah.
The airport's got to be like on board here, right? I mean,
Yes.
they're probably watching this pretty closely.
They're our largest single payer currently.
Yeah.
How much do they pay?
I don't know that number. It's like 43% of the current revenue.
Chunky.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think that's
No?
it.
Okay.
One last
thank-
pitch. It's raining
Yeah.
a lot more lately in lots of places.
Yeah.
So I would just urge you to think about both the rainfall and the pump stations. We haven't really talked a lot
Are those
about-
electric?
They are electric.
Are they getting new ones?
We're getting some new ones, and should voters choose, some of the other improvements would be to ensure that these pump stations have the capability to connect to external power sources, which we currently lack. And just to give you a sense that the type of generator that you need to run one of these pump stations is 2 semi-trucks. Our 2 largest pump stations can fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in about 90 seconds. So just to see the type of volume that we need to be able to move to keep people dry. So the other piece that we haven't talked about is when the legislature created this new district, they added some obligations, which I think make the agency much more modern and more community focused. Those things include considering contributions to water quality when we're doing our work. Right now, we just convey water. We're not responsible for what's in it or stirring up sediments or anything. So we now need to start to think a little bit about how our operations might impact water quality. We have to think about habitat and landscape resilience. So one of the things that, should voters choose to approve this, there's about $27 million allocated for floodplain restoration, which we know from experience. The Troutdale Reynolds Industrial Project got built. A lot of new impervious area came into the floodplain. We actually restored a wetland in partnership with the port that stores some of that additional water, takes pressure off of our pump station so we don't have to move as much water as quickly, and creates habitat and other benefits. So those are really important things that I think will benefit our community. And last, they asked us to, for the first time, actually consider equity and social justice. So you get to contracting and some of those kinds of things. The legacy districts aren't obligated to do any of that. And then I think one of the most interesting parts of the new mandates is a mandate to actually say, share the story of the floodplain and the cultural history of the floodplain. And I think there's a lot of interesting things around Japanese internment. There's a lot of things about Italian immigrants who were the original farmers. There's things around Vanport and Black history and so on that I think could really allow this district to invest in those communities and give them a stronger voice in the future.
Sorry, this
So-
jogged my memory. There definitely was opposition, specifically to you guys lowering the amount of the bond, right? Because initially you were going to go out for what, 200?
195.
195, and then you lowered it because the governor said, I'm not going to support that. PBA said, I'm not going to support that. Sorry, Portland Metro Chamber. Correct? And environmentalists were very unhappy about that because what was going to get cut from your guys' original plan were some environmental protections. Am I wrong?
I think there were some choices that had to be made as we navigated this new kind of structure around taxes. And I think the good news is we've landed on an area that everyone's okay with. You know, it's notable to me that both the Portland Metro Chamber and a bunch of the environmental community, including Bob Salinger and Willamette River Keepers and other organizations, all put in voter support statements on this. And so I think they feel like, yes, we would like to do more, but we've arrived at something that's going to work for everybody.
But
And
they're
so-
all modestly unhappy, right? I'm going to be happier if they're all modestly
I
unhappy.
think that's fair.
I think that's
you know,
fair.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm
That's been my
surprised- yeah, yeah.
experience of it.
I don't think I'm saying anything shocking to say, you know, to get the Portland Metro Chamber to put in a statement in favor of taxes was probably something they grudgingly did and weren't stoked to do, but I think we've gotten there, and I think, you know, they even saw that there was a very strong business case for this, and that, you know, there is a larger conversation to be had about tax burden in the community, but this is clearly not the place to have it.
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah,
Where-
thank
Where
you
is
guys
your
for coming.
office?
We're kind of across the street from the food bank. If you know where the food bank is,
Yeah.
33rd and Elrod.
Mhm.
We're way tucked back in there. Where
That's
one
not
of
far
our
from
conversations is.
the DMV.
No,
Yeah.
our
Just keep
DQ.
going.
DQ, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the-
Yeah, right there.
I connect those two
Makes it
things in
easy
my
to
head,
get your
yeah.
registration renewed.
So you're kind of walking the walk, you're in the zone.
We are in the zone.
They're right
Yeah.
there.
And one of the climate resilience issues that we're talking about with our board is potentially having some operational space that we would lease. We typically get pretty good warning if there's going to be a major flood event, and so we could stage some of our equipment off-site. So we're working on that as part of our new expanded focus.
How's the camper population out there now, though?
You know, I am
Haven't been out there in
really
a while.
pleased with everybody's help, right? Every Portland and the county and Metro, obviously in the height of the pandemic, it was really challenging
It
for
was,
everybody. But we're doing pretty well. And when we see people coming in, we contract with a not-for-profit that goes out and does outreach, and we try and connect them with services. We connect them with Multnomah County when we can, and then follow a lot of the same procedures where we'll provide a 7-day notice and try and, you know, our ops team will help jumpstart cars and you know, try and help people move to a different
Yeah.
location. And we try and explain to them. Some of them camp in low areas where they're actually at flood risk. One of the biggest challenges has been folks on the levees and digging into the levees to create steps and things, and so we've had to try and do education work and let people know that, yeah, not a great idea.
Quick question. This just came up for me in my head because you mentioned not the education of the campers, but the education of the wider community about historical inequities and internment and Vanport and a variety of very important historical concepts. This isn't paying for that, though, right?
No, the operational budget as proposed to the board for the year one includes about $500,000 to engage in that work.
So yes or no? Sorry, I'm
The bond doesn't
Not part
pay
of
for it.
not part of it. Not
No.
part of this.
Well, I guess that's not entirely true because should voters pass it, then each project would try and incorporate some of these things into it. So you might see some signage. You might see some of the, I don't know, I'm making this up. You might see an
Placement,
eco roof
yeah.
on a pump station to try and minimize impacts. You know.
Right. I guess those would be incredibly small line items, right?
Yeah,
We're not talking
it's like the
about
1% for art sort of
Yeah,
thing would
okay,
be the
okay.
model. And then we have ongoing operational revenue of $500,000 a year currently recommended to the board.
Got it. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thank you
coming in,
guys.
gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thanks for your
Appreciate
time.
it.